Well, hello everybody, once again, and welcome to this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. As usual, my name is Ibrahim Anoba, and this month we will be looking at the East African Federation. And I think people often confuse it with the East African Community, which I think could be quite two different things, which is the reason why we have amazing scholars to help us understand why the East African Federation is first important and how it could be actualized to the fullest capacity. And to help us understand that, we have Professor Raphael Obonyo. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. And he is an adjunct professor at Brandeis University in the US, where he teaches international youth policy. Professor Obonyo has extensive knowledge and expertise in public policy, international development, political economy, governance, and human rights. He serves as the World Bank's Global Youth Network, Global Diplomatic, as World Bank's Global Network, Global Diplomatic Forum, and African Leadership Institute Board. He serves on those organizations board. He holds a master's degree in public policy from Duke, and he is a Ford Foundation Fellow. Professor Obonyo is a multi-award winning author and co-author of many books. Welcome, Professor Obonyo.
Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to join you guys today.
Sure. And the second guest we have today, who will be joining us momentarily, is Professor Henry Amadi, and he holds a PhD in political science from University of Leipzig in Germany. He has a master's degree in international relations from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and he's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the same university. And Professor Amadi is also, he has several years of experience in teaching research and supervision in international relations, political economy, political sociology, public policy analysis, and security governance. He has several publications to his name. So we will welcome Professor Amadi when he comes in. But I hope we can get straight into it. So Professor Obonyo, as you can imagine, majority of our listeners are not from East Africa, although we do have a huge contingent listening from Kenya, Tanzania, and elsewhere. But oftentimes we have students or youth leaders listening from the UK, from West Africa, so from South Africa. And many might not be really familiar with the East African Federation, which, as I said earlier, is not the same thing as East African Community, or am I wrong? And in other words, how can you introduce someone who is not familiar with this organization to the organization?
Thank you so very much, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to join you. I think such conversations are needed for information, for education, for better awareness. And they say when people are informed, they get involved. So part of what we are doing in terms of this conversation is for us to raise awareness, consciousness in a way that we can get involved. And jumping into the question on the issue of East Africa Federation, and our topic today, largely from what I got, was to try and have a conversation on East African Federation as a trade bloc and possibility for African integration. And so just before, I mean, to help us and have a good understanding of East African Federation, we need to look at the journey where we are coming from. And just briefly, is that this was an idea, the idea of integration within the East Africa was an idea that was mooted way back in 1917. And then it was Kenya and Uganda, which are countries in two countries in East Africa that were trying to figure out on how can we do trade better. You know, how can we make it more seamless? How can we lift barriers so that we can be able to exchange goods and services in a way that enables us to grow our economy? And so Uganda and Kenya walked the journey and later on Tanganyika then will subscribe to that idea of working together to be able to, to move goods and services across their borders. But East African community, as we know it, was set up in 1967, and largely that the first three countries were Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And like I say, the idea was largely on trading. How can we trade together? How can we exchange goods and services? Later on, of course, we would have countries like Rwanda and Burundi join. And so it will be Kenya, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and then Rwanda, Burundi. And then more recently, we've had Sudan joining the East African community. And more recently, we also have DRC also joining the community. And now we also have Somalia that have expressed interest. And on the other side, there are also calls for Ethiopia to join the East African community. And why the East African community? Of course, the issue of trading, exchanging goods and services and lifting the barriers. Also, there was the other aspect of political federation. And that's why we hear a lot about the East African Political Federation. So there's quite a bit that has been realized in terms of economic integration and in terms of lifting barriers to trade. And if you look at that, a number of monumental progress have been achieved. For example, we have customs union protocol, have agreed on certain custom union issues. We have the common market protocol, and then we have the monetary union protocol that has also been put in place. But the challenge that we are still having, while largely people have agreed, countries, member states have agreed on how to move when it comes to economic issues, it hasn't been very easy to agree on how to move when it comes to political federation in terms of political right. issues. And we know economy and matters politics move together. So what I'm trying to say is that quite a bit of progress has been made in terms of economics, the aspect of economy, but there's still quite a bit of hurdles caused by mistrust, caused by suspicion, caused by certain disagreements on formation of East Africa political federation.
Yeah, you know what's actually first of all, thank you for that breakdown, Professor Amadi. I'm sorry, Professor Obonyo. I hope my network is not frozen.
No,
but it
can hear you.
Frozen. It's probably from my end or from your end. But the thing is, I think that's a fantastic introduction for many people who might not know what the proposed East African Federation is. However, it reminds me of the many activities of the first generation of post-independence African leaders, like Nkrumah, like Nyerere. This was many, many of them pushed for federations like this. I remember Nyerere actually, I think, was trying to delay Tanganyika's independence so that there could be some form of East African Federation, political federation, not economic necessarily, political unit, one sovereign state. So this, of course, brings back those memories. So I was wondering, Professor Amadi, first of all, welcome to the conversation. We're glad to have you. We already introduced you before you came in. So I was wondering if you could help our audience understand why such a political union is important. Because one, we do appreciate that we are Africans, but we do have diverse cultural backgrounds. The cultural values in Tanzania is not necessarily the same thing as the cultural values in Kenya. So I was wondering if you could help give some justification for why this federation is important in the first place.
Thank you so much, Mr. Skapa. I hope you are getting me clear.
Yes, actually,
yes, we can hear
you. Ibrahim, not Skapa. That's our technical technical person's account. But anyway, you can go ahead.
I want to point out some bit of background. The EAC is what actually should lead us to an East African federation. A federation is actually a political union. So we are in the process of getting to a federation, but we are not there. That is my main point. And the idea of an East African federation actually also preoccupied the British, who are the colonizers of the 3 East African countries. And the main motivation at that time was that Britain found it convenient to govern the region as a bloc. But now, in the immediate post-independence era, now we see political motives being the main reason driving the need to perpetuate these efforts. And the motives here focus more on sovereignty, issues about sovereignty. These countries, just having attained their independence, they were, would you say, jealous of their sovereignty. They wanted to establish their sovereignty. And this was the main reason. So the motives were more political at that time. And economic motives were there, but they actually came after the political motives, which were the main driving force. Then around 1980s now, we are seeing a new East African community because the earlier one collapsed in 1977 because of a number of reasons. Now we are seeing a new East African community, which you could say the second, we could describe it as the second East African community. And the main driving force here is now economic motives. The main driving force is, and it's a very big challenge because it is muddled up with political motives. You know, third world countries are poor, and by virtue of being poor, it is more difficult for people to come together in poverty than it is for people to come together in prosperity.
If I get you correctly, sorry,
there is more interdependence.
Professor Amadi, can you hear me? I was
Yes.
That's something that's very important, and I wish you could clarify. So you are saying that this East African Federation that is being proposed on paper as a political union is actually being driven by economic motives. Is that what you're saying?
The main motive is the economic motive.
Really?
Let me explain. From around the 80s, you know, we are seeing globalization picking up. There is more interdependence. And interdependence came with positives and negatives. But for third world countries, the negatives outweigh the positives. Because as you know, globalization favors countries that export, but it harms countries that are net importers. And that's where we find the EAC member states. So the idea about globalization was that it was marginalizing countries that were poor. And these were mainly in Africa. The poorest were mainly in Africa. It was hurting them. And they had no option, therefore, but to come together in blocks so that the effects of globalization could be minimized by them really expanding their markets. Because without that, you see, they would be dumping ground, and this would not portend well for their future. I believe we are together there.
Yes.
So globalization here.
Yeah, I get the point. So the point you're trying to make is, one, there's economic reason driving this political union, even though we already have the East African Economic Bloc. And number two, you are talking about globalization. So those two are very, very interesting points. But before I go to Professor Obonyo, I want to remind our listeners that you can actually be part of the conversation by raising your hands. So if you raise your hand, I will bring you onto onto the panel, and you can ask your question. You will have your video on and your audio very on too, but you will have to make it brief. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. So Professor Obonyo, I was wondering, so we know that the same countries, virtually the same countries in the East African community will pretty much be in the East African Federation, I mean, to a large extent. So what do you think both organizations will complement each other? Or do you think it's an unnecessary distraction? Are we already getting enough from the East African Economic Bloc? Or why do we even need a federation? What do we stand to gain? What do countries like South Sudan stand to gain by being part of a unified sovereign state?
Thank you so very much. Let me just pick it from where Prof left it, first of all, on the issue of what is actually driving the idea of the federation. But I want to trace it back from post-independence and what the two ideologies or approaches were. If we remember, in West Africa, I mean, there was Nkrumah who was leading the group that was saying, we need political federation now. We need to collapse all these borders so that we just have a united Africa. And then there was Nyerere and team who are also saying that that's a good idea, but it can't be done instantly. Let's realize it incrementally. And the way to realize it incrementally was, let's start with what in public policy people would call quick wins, or project management, they call quick wins. And what are the quick wins? It's easier for people to agree on certain economic interests. So people can agree on to a large extent on certain economic issues, but political issues are always more difficult for people to agree. And like Prof did say, issues of sovereignty, not so many people want to negotiate. Not so many countries want to negotiate or cede ground on that. But when it comes to maybe having a common, customs union, to a large extent, people will agree. And so I think if you asked me, Nyerere's group won the day, and that's why we are trying to realize this EAC federation incrementally, starting by economic union or cooperation or integration, whatever we call it. And we are hoping that that would lead to political federation, which hasn't been easy, though. Even up to now, we are now at the level of, I think, countries are trying to, EAC trying to have consultations and engagement with stakeholders in different countries, the member states. But I think it's still very, very difficult because there are a lot of questions on who is going to lead the federation. How will we define the leadership? What will the constitution be like? You've already talked about the differences. Even though we are neighbors and we are supposed to interact and engage more, we have a lot of, some glaring differences on when it comes to culture or social issues, even language to some extent. But having said that, I think there is a lot of gain for member states. One, by being part of economic integration, ESC as we know it, because obviously the global trend is that you are not viable as an economic entity if you're tiny, if you're small, and most African countries are fairly small. So when it comes to trade, they end up being emasculated. They don't achieve much. They don't benefit much from trading within Africa and beyond. And also, for you to have a strong sort of economic sort of integration or an economic bloc, there are a lot of political aspects that needs to be realized. And I think that is where EAC, they've realized we cannot make headway without political federation. We will not achieve much economically without political federation. And that's why now, if you look at EAC where we are, there's a shift now, almost realize because of economic interest.
Right. Okay, I got your point, but I hope you can hear me, because I'm currently in Nigeria, so the internet seems to be kind of shaky. But the one thing anyway, first of all, your point is really important. It seems as though, as you suggest, that the EAC is seeing and initiating an organization.
Professor Obonyo, I hope you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, and I see Ibrahim is back also, yeah.
Right, so I'm in Nigeria, and I guess, you guys are in the UK, US, so you can tell the difference by the fact that, first of all, it's darker here and it's lighter on your end. Of course, so I was actually talking about the fact that I'm just trying to get it right. It seems as though the EAC, of course, an economic bloc, but as you and Professor Amadi are saying, it seems as though they are concerned that their economic, what's it called, agenda, their goals are not going to be realized until they create a political union. Now, my own concern personally, I've always been, I'm not really against the fact that, African countries want to unite. I'm always concerned about the fact that you look at countries like Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire, when you have a lot of ethnic groups and they got submerged into one, and you can barely identify the interests of other ethnic groups, because the bigger ethnic group, like in Nigeria, we have the Hausa Fulani, they run the show in the country. So I'm thinking about, if that happens with the EAF, and we bring together all these different people, it's going to be like, I think, the 7th largest country in the world. So that looks promising. But the reality is that we've seen this failed when Ghana, Guinea, and Mali united, I think, in the 60s. I hope you remember that, when Nkrumah and Sékou Touré united their country. And I think we also had the same problem when Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was also trying to do the same thing with Egypt, Sudan, and I think one other country. So my problem is that the question of power, how are we going to ensure, or what do you think will be the power sharing formula? Looking at cases like Nigeria, do you think, let's start with Professor Amadi, do you think that we could encounter a problem of power sharing or power devolution in such a large federation, regardless of the fact that they mostly speak Swahili or they share a lot of cultural similarities? Do you think there could be a problem of power sharing in such a federation? Your microphone is muted.
That is really a challenge, Mr. Ibrahim. It's a big challenge. But when I talk about this problem, I look at it in terms of how it can be evaded. How it can be evaded. You see, we are in a situation where economic interests are the ones that are going to define our survival. So political interests are there. Political interests are there. But we cannot push them ahead of economic interests. So they may have to take a backseat because of those problems, the diversity issues. They may have to take a backseat. It is a reality, Mr. Ibrahim, that we are in a ethnically divided society. Almost all African countries are. And this is something that you can overcome through a lot of pain. You can see Africans easily hide behind their ethnic cocoons every time there's a problem. I think in Nigeria and Kenya, I think these are very obvious. So what we are doing here is that we are focusing more on economic interests, because these are defining our survival. And as Professor Obonyo has rightly said, we know our problem is basically small markets. We have small markets. Therefore, our markets they cannot really attract or entice those other countries in the developed world. So we have a challenge in that area, and coming together as a market may have almost no effect on our ethnic diversities. Other things being equal, it may have no, and this can be pushed on for some time as we deal with these ethnic issues. And I want to say that getting a larger market for us is very useful, if I add weight to what Professor Obonyo has said, because we can use it as a bargaining chip to try and tilt the international environment in our favor.
Exactly.
Because if we don't do that, we have no future. We cannot dream of industrialization in a global environment in which goods are coming into our countries from those developed countries and killing our industries. And we are talking about industrialization. It is self-defeating. We have to create these large markets, and the first priority should be to use these large markets as a bargaining clout or a bargaining chip to alter the environment. The environment is one which favors countries with exporting capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the power to push it on and on,
right,
because of our. So that is really my point. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, Prof. You see, I mean, it's common sense. Countries like China, India, they are pushing heavily to become, dominant in the global economy. And to a large extent, this is because of their capacity to command a huge population and a huge, labor force, and of course, land mass. And I think, the East African Federation could also be eyeing the same thing. But I wonder, Professor Obonyo, because again, my concern is you look at the people running East Africa currently. Look at people like our leader in Uganda, Professor Museveni, some other questionable people like, Salva Kiir Meredith, who have horrendous human rights violation records. And if we think about giving more power to African leaders from East Africa, do you think we could be dealing with the same human rights problem, the same political instability problem, the same problem of minoritizing some other ethnic groups? Do you think we're going to be dealing with the same questions in the East African Federation, or do you think they're going to disappear?
Thank you so very much. I think that's an important question. First, let me say that, just like globalization and things like urbanization, political federation is inevitable. We can postpone it all we want, but it is inevitable. We have to do it at some point. It's like something you have to do it. You can keep postponing it the much you want. We've been postponing this idea of political federation since post-independence, remember, when we were all talking about Pan-Africanism. Of course, now we are not driven so much by Pan-Africanism, like Prof did say. It's now more of economic interest and economic survival. But it's because we didn't realize it in the 60s. Now we are in 2020s, and we realize, man, if we don't actualize this political federation, we are doomed, both economically, politically, culturally, and even socially, and even in terms of security. So it is something that has to be done. Yesterday we are late, actually. So
right.
this is what.
A little pushback. Anyway, if you are in the audience, you can actually raise your hands and you will be brought up to the panel, or you can ask your question directly. But I've encountered this question a lot. And people will say, wait, hold on. Why do we need a big federation? You look at countries like Hong Kong. Let's even come to Africa. Look at countries like Rwanda, small into its capacity. Look at countries like, Seychelles, or Botswana. Those countries are not really big, but they are doing tremendously well. So imagine if this country are already doing well economically, and we're trying to bring them into a federation. Don't you think, Prof. Obonyo, that we are possibly going to be reversing the economic progress because we want to achieve this fancy idea of a federation? I'm going to ask you the same question, Professor Amadi, but I want to hear your response first, Professor Obonyo.
Yeah, I mean, there is no doing well if your neighbor is not doing well. You know that thing they normally say that the rich cannot sleep because the poor are awake and the poor are hungry. You know, so it's just a matter of time before the poor come after you. So there is no progress for Botswana if there is no progress for Lesotho. There is no progress for Nigeria if there is no progress for Benin and Togo. There is no progress for Kenya if there is no progress for Somalia and Sudan. And I think that is the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And if it's not just the spirit, it's the reality that if you are the only one doing well in a continent of 54 countries, then your survival, your security, your stability itself is threatened. That's why there's need for interaction and integration. But just back to the political federation and why it is important. It is important because most of these economic aspirations and desires cannot be realized without political federation. You look at, for example, what it has taken for countries to agree on the monetary union in East Africa. Now there is a huge debate of, let's stop that first. Let's think of who is going to house the central bank. Which country is going to house it? Exactly. It means that we will get stuck there because until we agree on which country is going to, and that's a political issue more than an economic issue.
That makes sense.
So a political federation is important to ensure that some of the economic requirements, desires, and aspirations are realized. Otherwise, there won't be any economic progress.
Okay, so I'll have Professor Amadi answer the same question.
On, for example, what model of constitution?
Yeah, I agree with you. A lot of things you said. We can't really, if we keep fixating on one problem, we're not going to move anywhere. So I guess that's one of the reasons why they want to have a federation. But Professor Amadi, I wanted to respond to the same question before I bring one of those participants to come on board. But before you answer that question, I want to remind you that in this federation, you have countries like Rwanda that are tremendously doing well in terms of economy. And you have countries like, as I'm seeing, South Sudan, DR Congo, Burundi. Don't you think, Prof, that if we bring all these people together, that Rwanda is going to potentially suffer? Or do you think it's going to be the other way around? I think your microphone is muted again. Your microphone is muted, Prof.
Microphone, Prof.
The microphone is muted.
Hello, now you're getting me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
We can hear you now.
To bring in a point about remedial measures, because you have touched on something to do with the human rights violations. Remedial measures may sometimes be difficult when we only have one sovereign at the top, and that's the state. Because if the state is the violator, there is no further appeal. But if we create a higher level, and we give it more sovereignty or more power in terms of decision, then it will also serve as a point at which complaints are targeted from each of the member states. This has been happening in Europe. And if you look at the European scene, you'll find that many cases of human rights violations have increasingly been targeting the EU because the governments, the national governments, appear to be blind about it. We can try that. And I think that life without remedies is actually something that is very pathetic. So we need remedies always.
Right.
And that is one point. That's one point.
Mm-hmm.
I want to also agree with you that when we share problems, sometimes those who are prosperous may be taken back. And I am referring to that one as insecurity dilemma. Because we transfer our insecurities to others. But you know what we are looking at here is that for the case of the East African community, the first East African community, which collapsed in 1977, already had a problem of insecurity. It already had a problem because Kenya appeared to be reaping most of the benefits. Why was it reaping most of the benefits? It was reaping most of the benefits because it appears to have been ahead. It had a head start compared to either Uganda or Tanzania. So there's a tendency for such initiatives, such regional integration initiatives, to reward the more endowed countries more than it rewards the less endowed. It contributes to polarization, economic polarization, and the insecurity that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it has argued many times that the main failure of the first East African community was actually to do with that failure to create a supranational body that could regulate between the three countries and could resolve conflicts. Because you remember the moment Nyalala refused to talk to Amin, it was done. Nothing else was done. So we are saying that there is need for a supranational institution, and a federation can create that. It can create a government at the center,
right,
which is able to supervise the activities of the regional governments and also resolve conflicts whenever they occur, especially things to do with inequalities that are most likely to be compounded. Right. Because labor, everything goes to the more endowed country.
I mean, yeah, you're right, Prof. I buy into the argument. A lot of people actually make that argument too, that not only what Professor Obonyo said, that Rwanda can actually not have a long-lasting economic prosperity if its neighbors are poor, and of course, your own argument that sometimes such integration will enlarge and secure and preserve the achievements that countries like Rwanda already have. So now I think we can take people who have raised their hand. We have some questions in the Q&A, but first, let's see if we can bring Kolawole Olarinde up. Kolawole Olarinde, are you able to ask your question in 20 seconds?
Actually, good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me? Am I audible enough, please?
Yes, you're audible enough. Please go ahead and ask your question.
So I already typed my question in the Q&A, so maybe I'll do it to recap everything now. So while Professor Raphael Obonyo was giving a speech, he made mention of something that you're not viable as an economy entity if you are small. So my focus there is the small. Does that mean that you have political power or you need to create a union? That's my question, sir. I'm done with my question, sir, Professor Obonyo.
Okay, that's nice.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think, do you want to take that question, Professor Obonyo?
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah. Let me just respond to that really quick. When I talk about a viable entity economically, I mean just in terms of market. You have no bargaining power if you are if you are a small country, and by that I mean a small market, and that is the global, that is the trend now globally in terms of economic order. that if you're a tiny country, it becomes very difficult. A small country or a small market, it becomes very difficult for you to bargain and get a better deal. But the reason why there's emphasis on political federation is it's to create a bigger market. You realize there are a lot of other political concerns that need to be addressed. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed and things that can only be sorted out through a political union or a political federation. So it basically means, even though we've made quite a bit of progress when it comes to economic integration and union, we've realized that there's actually nothing much we can do until we unlock the benefits using, or rather through a political federation. And that's why both of them are more or less intertwined and indivisible. They need to move together now.
All right, thank you, Prof. Okay, let's try to see if we can bring on board Najibullah Yao Musa. Najibullah Yao Musa, are you there? Are you able to ask your question? Najibullah, are you able to ask a question? You have to unmute yourself to ask your question, Najibullah. Okay, I guess they are not there. So we move to the queue, to the questions in the Q&A. Oh, are you there now? I can see your microphone is unmuted, but I don't think we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, my question goes to the like how Prof said that a country cannot develop if the neighboring country is actually poor. Does that mean that a country should stop like making effort to develop economically until it helps its neighboring country develop? Oh, because from my own perspective, what I think is that African countries should be allowed to realize themselves individually before any federation, because making a federation may lead to political instability. For example, if you take Nigeria, where we have diverse cultures, it's just like you are taking different African countries together. That diversity may lead to political instability due to, Rationale's principles, different cultures, and all of that. Why not, if each country realized itself like Rwanda, then we have more political stability and economic stability. Then by then, I think the easier and it will be smooth going than how we are now.
Thank you. Fantastic question. Professor Amadi, I'll allow you to answer that question. And I think it speaks my mind and the minds of many people, but I'll let you answer that question, Professor Amadi.
Thank you. I think I agree. That is the elephant in the room. It is the elephant. It is why we are going to perish together. We will perish together because we have decided that we just face the world individually. And when things become bad, they are bad for both the prosperous and the non-prosperous. Mm-hmm. They don't discriminate. For example, Rwanda is in Africa. So if Africa is in a mess, Rwanda will not be excluded. But my main point is this. My main point is that if things go the way they are going, then in the long term, none of us will be spared if things go the way they are going. So if we think in the long term, then it is important to sacrifice some of our immediate interests for the sake of the longer term interest, which is more communal and which is more enduring. Because we want Africa to break away from bondage, from slavery. We know we are faced with the slavery of bondage. We are the underdogs in the national system. And we want to break away from that. We won't do that if we continue thinking about tomorrow and not 10 years or 20 years to come.
Because
Africa is in a very bad situation. So we have just no option. I think that Professor Obonyo had made that point. We have no option.
Okay.
We can delay this, but we eventually have to embrace it. So it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. So it's a point. Thank you. I think that's a good defense. Now we come to the quick fire section of the episode where we ask your question. We have questions in the Q&A box. So we ask the question and you have to answer within 1 minute. And I'll be sure to cut after 1 minute. So let's go. The first one is from Nathaniel Yakoye. And they ask, and this goes to you, Professor Obonyo. Sorry for the problem that occurred in the previous. Let us continue on the top. That African Federation is a very important idea to get economic and political advantages. But my worry is feasibility issue. How real is it? How to pass the challenges that we face, and how do we organize it? Professor Obonyo, 1 minute.
I think one is to learn from lessons from attempts that have been made before. It's been done, like you said, Ghana and Ghana tried to do it in West Africa. It didn't work. It doesn't mean it won't work now. We just need to learn lessons from that. Second is we need to have public awareness. Extremely important that now it can't just be a few leaders talking about it. It has to be something that involves everybody, everyone, so that we agree on how do we move forward. So there is need for intensive, extensive consultations that brings everyone on board. Then we need to agree on a governance model that works for all of us. It's not like we are going to impose a particular system on people. So I think we need to agree on a model that would work for all of us. And most importantly is we need to make sure that it is something that is going to only bring people who are positive and who have clean records. And it will help us also to deal with challenges like human rights issues, like people overstaying in power, because now that we will deal with that in terms of a political federation. So I think there's a lot of positivity.
Thank you. I think I must have infected Professor Amadi with my low network virus, but I hope he survives it and he gets back. So you take the next question yet again. Then if he joins, you take the following question. And this is from Disciple Mukuli. And they say, my name is Disciple Mukuli from Zimbabwe. I agree with Prof. to that extent, but I need more clarity on political federation. I think the problem is among governments. Some countries are being led by the revolutionaries, and some are being led by the opposition Democrats. So how can we unite them first for us to move on with an African intra-trade and some form of unity issues? You want to take that, Professor Obonyo? 1 minute.
I mean, for me, it's just agreeing on an ideal. Of course, we have different ideologies, just like Nyerere, for example, subscribed to socialism that time, right? And countries like Kenya did subscribe to a large extent capitalism, but still there was sort of some bare minimum, some basics that we agreed on. So I think while there are many things that perhaps could make us look different, there are certain things that really make us look the same. So we are different but the same. So we need to identify what are these things that we share and build on those. And obviously we are not very far from each other when it comes to political ideology. I think it's just in terms of harmonizing and agree on what do we take ahead with us and what do we leave aside. So I think there's a possibility for the revolutionaries and as you call them, the modern era Democrats, to be able to find ways of agreeing on a model that can work for all of us. Because like I said, political federation is inevitable, because otherwise, if we remain in our small cocoons and corners, we are all going to suffer the tragedy of being extinct.
Right, thank you for that. Professor Amadi, I see you are here, but you will have to activate your video and microphone again, because I think the bad network virus got to your end. Well, sorry for infecting you with that virus. But anyway, if you can unmute your microphone and activate your video, that'll be nice. Okay, I think you have another device. are you, I think you are almost there. Professor Amadi, are you able to respond to the question? Okay, while we try to have you have the technical, okay, I think you are here. Professor Amadi, are you able to respond to the question now? Okay, we ran out of time. Again, maybe I'll take the question again back to you, Professor Obonyo. This is from Brian Tumusime, and they ask, don't you think the merging of East African countries will cause social economic imbalance between member states, where some states will be greater than others? I think we already answered that, but you want to give a quick response to Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really just the way you look at it. You can look at it in terms of the weak will bring down the strong, or you might look at it in terms of the strong will bring up the weak when they come together. And I think all of us are not interested in the strong coming down. We want the weak or the not so strong to be lifted up. And that is perhaps the model that we need to agree on. How do we realize that? But I think the idea of the federation or integration where we are, it's not for lesser for people to emasculate each other. It's for people to lift up each other, and there's a high chance of that. Like I said, the rich cannot sleep because the poor is awake and the poor is hungry. So it is upon the rich to say, look, let's share with the poor, and it is upon the poor to say, look, if I steal from the rich will be poor, and then again we are going to suffer, all of us. So I think it's just agreeing on a model that works. But having said that, I must emphasize that political federation won't be easy. It's not a walk in the park. Mm-hmm. It is contested. There are disagreements, there are divergent views. But what I'm insisting that it is inevitable, and so we have to negotiate up to the point that we agree on a model that will work for all of us.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that, Prof. So, Professor Amadi, we hope you are there because we can see you. Just that your audio seems not to be connecting. If you are there, can you indicate that you're there? Otherwise, we'll ask one more question and we'll wrap up. I think then Professor Obonyo will still have to do the honors yet again. And this question is from Tatenda Chimoto. They ask, integrating economies is a very good idea, but the problem that we face as Africans is that it sometimes revert our development and integration. Okay, and they further say, of our interest, factions, conflict, and individualism. Individualism does not work in Africa. These countries need to work together collectively to solve these issues, removing imbalances between each state. Of course, before you answer that, Professor Obonyo, we know that countries should still have the right to determine their fate until this unification happens. And even if the unification happens, ethnicities, different nationalities should still have the right to have their say within the federation. That is non-negotiable. So individualism sometimes is not always wrong. People have their rights to express their aspirations. But you want to answer, or a lady fears of Tatenda Chimoto, Prof?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that we do not necessarily lose our identities or our sovereignty. It's just that we cede certain powers. I think that is what a federation is all about. It does not mean that you now lose your ethnicity, you stop subscribing to certain cultural and social beliefs. It just means that you are now in a bigger pool where you can, and I think the idea of a federation can only work also if you appreciate the diversity. And right. Diversity does not necessarily make us weaker. Mm-hmm. Diversity makes us strong also. It's unfortunate that
Nigeria is a bad case.
Yes, and you see that in many cases. Look at Kenya, for example. We are just about over 40 ethnic groups, and the tension between the various ethnic groups is unbelievable compared to Tanzania, which has many more ethnic groups, but they've been able to to live together in harmony in a way that they appreciate that the diversity makes them stronger. So I think it's really just how we're able to look at it, and also the leadership. There is need for leadership. Political federation is not just a conglomeration and amalgamation of people. It requires visionary leadership. So it won't work and happen without visionary leaders who see beyond their little interest, see beyond now, and see into the future. So that will be very important.
Well, that's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Professor Obonyo, for answering those questions. And of course, to Professor Amadi, it's unfortunate we couldn't connect with you towards the end of the program. But again, all the questions we cannot take, we hope you can ask the guests directly through their social media accounts. But again,